Okay, this tutorial is on working with Painter and Photoshop, kind of going back and forth and some of the strengths and also some of the weaknesses in doing that. To begin with, what you most likely want to do is make sure that your color management is set up the same for Photoshop as well as Painter, and I would advise you to basically work your way around Photoshop because I think the manager is probably superior compared to Painter. So with Photoshop, what you want to do is go up to Edit, go to Color Settings, go ahead and kind of see what you have here, and then go ahead and go to Painter, and then go to Canvas, and then underneath Canvas, at the very bottom, you have Color Management, and that opens up this dialog box. And what you basically want to do is make sure that the settings here are basically the same as these settings. For example, we have Adobe RGB 1998, and then we have the same for Painter. And then you can kind of adjust these how you want to. I have mine on a generic monitor, and all these other settings you can kind of figure out on your own. Next thing you want to do is be aware of some of the things that work really well in Painter that may not necessarily translate to Photoshop. Now, whenever going back and forth between Painter and Photoshop, the biggest thing that you want to do is when you're saving the document, let's say you want to take a Painter document into Photoshop, when you save it, just go ahead, save as the Photoshop document. Otherwise, it's not going to recognize it. Okay, another thing you want to know about working with Painter and Photoshop is some of the brushes do not work in Photoshop. In other words, they don't really translate that well. The biggest one that I can mention right off the bat is the watercolor brush. As you know, you have two different kinds of watercolor brushes. In Painter, you have watercolor, you have the digital watercolor. The watercolor, the one I'm working with right here, as you can see, it really kind of mimics watercolor really well. It actually kind of bleeds down. Really nice brush. The problem is Photoshop doesn't really read it that well. What it'll do is it'll basically flatten the image. As you know, with a watercolor brush in Painter, it creates this whole new watercolor layer, and you can only work with the watercolor brushes on top of it. I have a separate tutorial on watercolor brushes to begin with. The nice thing about this is you can always go back here, open up the watercolor menu under brush controls and show water, and go ahead and kind of tweak this layer. If you want to like re-wet it, or you want to kind of play around the direction of the wind, all that kind of fun stuff. What you want to do is, if you're going to go back and forth between Painter and Photoshop, what I would advise you to do is just when you're saving the document, like Riff is the default for Painter, just go ahead and save it as a Photoshop document. And lots of times I'll work throughout the whole project just saving my documents in Photoshop because it makes it a little bit easier. And I'll just go ahead and call this water 2 because I already have one water there. Save it on the desktop. Find my water 2. I'm going to pull that into Photoshop. And you can see it's opened it up. It looks pretty much the same, but you'll notice it's just reading it as like a normal layer. It's not like the special effects watercolor layer that you would have with a Painter. And what's kind of nice about this is now you can actually work with Photoshop brushes or whatever you'd want to do in Photoshop. And unlike Painter, you can actually draw right on top of this. It's not going to say that you can only work with the watercolor brush on this layer because now it is a Photoshop document. So it's basically kind of like, flatten the image for you. Another thing you want to watch out for with working with the two programs is the impasto effects. A lot of the brushes have that impasto effect. What I mean by that is like a kind of resembles a thick application of paint. In this case, this is just done with the acrylic. A lot of the brushes, if they say like in this case, a thick acrylic flat, it'll have that kind of three-dimensional aspect of it. In some cases, those brushes work really slow. Like in this case, this was a very slow brush stroke to actually make. There's a whole set of brushes called impasto, and I can kind of show you a couple of those. You can see it kind of mimics that three-dimensional aspect of it, of the paint stroke. This is really nice to play around with. The one thing that I find really frustrating with Painter is, let's say if I wanted to switch to another brush that isn't impasto, that's just regularly flat. I'll go ahead and go to acrylics and opaque acrylic, and I'll switch to another color. Now you can see I'm trying to kind of paint on top of this, but I still have that three-dimensional aspect showing through. It's almost as if I'm, painting transparent, but I'm actually painting in an opaque acrylic brush. So, technically you would think it would just, totally go over that and cover it. It doesn't, which is really frustrating. So what you'd want to do, this is one of the nice things about flipping back and forth, is just go ahead and save as a Photoshop document. Name it whatever you want. And I'll go ahead and close this actual document. I go ahead and find that document, and now this time around open it again in Painter. Now this time it's a Photoshop document. Even though Painter will open it up just fine. Now we can go ahead and do the same thing, and you can see it goes over it just fine. So that's kind of a pain about Painter, but you can see you can basically get rid of that problem by saving it as a Photoshop document, closing that Painter document, and then reopening it up as the Photoshop document. So that works out just fine. So those are the basics, just in terms of working with the two programs. A lot of it's just kind of playing around. There's a lot of things in Photoshop that don't necessarily translate to Painter, and vice versa, but for the most part I'd say 90% of the time they work totally fine. And what I would advise you to do in working with Painter is when you're kind of going back and forth, just go ahead and save it as a Photoshop document pretty much throughout the whole thing, and then you really won't run into too many problems.